Why does my coffee taste bitter when I make it at home, but not at a cafe? It's probably your brewing method or grind size. If the coffee's too bitter, you might be over-extracting it by using water that's too hot or brewing for too long. Cafes usually have the perfect grind and temperature control that's hard to match at home. Maybe try adjusting the grind size or experimenting with a different method like pour-over or French press to get a smoother cup. Add a pinch of salt to your grounds. If you don't tell us your brewing method, how will we know? Depends on your brewing method. Our coffee might be your best friends. I can tell you from experience that as I don't have an espresso machine when I order espressos, I will never get the same result from my maca pot, though I love my brew. When I get pour-overs, I can say I get pretty close results using the French press Hoffman method, and I get pretty good brews. My point is, I always get good results from my brews, maca pot or French press. What kind of machine are you using? Your coffee may be too finely ground for your maker, which could make it bigger. If the machine hasn't been cleaned for a while, you can clean it by brewing half water and half vinegar, then keep doing the brew cycle until the vinegar smell is gone. How much coffee are you using per cup? A tablespoon per cup is recommended. I recently started adding a 18 tsp of salt to my coffee grinds. Just like in baking, the salt enhances the flavor of the coffee and doesn't actually taste like salt. Too hot, cheap maker? That's usually the more common reason, is either cheap shitty beans or a boiling coffee maker. Coffee isn't as finicky as tea, but both can become bitter if steeps too long or steeps too hot. If the coffee tastes more bitter than at the cafe, it probably means that the brewing method you're using is over-extracting the coffee. The reasons for this depend on how you're brewing your coffee, but it mostly boils pun intended down to grind size, how tightly you pack your beans, how long you let the coffee steep for a French press or similar methods, and the quality of your machine, especially with espresso machines. In general, finer ground sizes mean more extraction, which means more bitterness. Likewise, if the coffee spends more time in contact with the water, that can mean more extraction and more bitterness. For espresso, and I believe drip coffee, as well, having the beans packed too tightly can make it harder for the water to get through, resulting in over-extraction. Finally, if you're roasting your beans at home, you should consider how dark the roast is. In general, the darker the roast, the more bitter the coffee will be. 60 of pod and supermarket coffee is slightly burnt. I hate its sooty cheap taste personally. High roast that is burnt tastes bitter. Most shop coffee has hardly any coffee in it, and it's poor quality burnt coffee. Sickening that so many offer this type. Such a con. IMO to have properly nice coffee, buy blend 3 type coffee and use a filter and filter paper. Ethiopian, Colombian are excellent, and if you want to make it as smooth as cafes, use the high roast and have the amount. It is generally very weak. Also, descale and clean your grinder. Should brew coffee at 90 C, above that it burns and turns bitter. If you're using a fancy drip brewer or a hand pour over method, make sure you bloom the grounds before brewing. That will help with bitterness. But you also need to make sure your grind is right for the brew method and that the water temp is right too. As other commenters said, tell us your brew method and we can better assist. Try making cold brew and heating it up. 0 bitterness. Use the clean cycle if the machine has one, and/or run it a couple of times with white vinegar. Be sure to run 2 or 3 times with clean water after that. Bitterness usually means over-extraction. Try a coarser grind or shorter brew time, and you'll get closer to that calf smoothness. It depends on the way it's prepared, also the type of beans. There was an episode of Bizarre Foods where he went to an enthusiast coffee shop in Seattle. The people there then proceeds to give Andrew Zimmerman multiple coffees with different tastes, but it was all made from the same beans, just the preparation method on their machine, how hot the water is, how long to brew, etc. is the difference. As others suggested, a pinch of salt will help, but that's not what the cafes are doing. It boils down to a difference in the brewing method. I make coffee in a French press. Personally, I think it's the best method, but it's a bit fusser than most people want to deal with. If you're using a drip brewer, you're probably going to get the worst possible results other than an antique percolator. If you want a simple method that may provide better results, pour over might be a good option for you. The primary difference as far as flavor is concerned between a pour over and a drip brewer is consistency in water temperature. Drip brewers are notoriously inconsistent with the temperature at which the water hits the coffee. Use a kettle to heat water, and a pour-over method gives you a much more consistent water temperature, and probably a more appropriate water temperature. Most drip brewers heat the water to about a 180 F, but ideally you want the water a little higher than that, around 200 F. So if you bring the water to a boil and let it cool for just a moment, you'll be right at a good temperature. I may be vastly over-explaining this and you may not want to do anything that complicated, but for me, it's worth it. Very few things bring me as much joy as a well-made cup of coffee. Use filtered water instead of tap water. I swear it helps a lot. Start using the water from the fridge with a clean filter and it will taste much better. Clean your gear. For the brewer there should be a liquid or a powder you run through it like you brew coffee, just without coffee. And clean your thermos or whatever you store your finished coffee in too. Tea here is a dishwasher powder that works well for this. If this doesn't help you can try adjusting the amount of coffee you use per brew. Adjust how well you grind the coffee if you do it yourself. For brewer too coarsely grounded coffee might make it bitter. The finer the grind, the more bitter the coffee can be. If you make regular coffee with espresso grind, you get very bitter coffee. That's why espresso uses steam. Also, if the water is too hot, you'll extract more of the bitterness. Further, each bean roast has an optimum coffee to water ratio, and you can experiment with the one that makes coffee the way you like it. These days I make 1 cup at a time using the Clever Coffee Maker. I have an electric pot with good control over the water temp, about 200 F works best for my brew. And then you need to figure out what beans and degree of roast you like. A pinch of salt in the grounds can help with bitterness.